I'm really happy to be here today with Ian Clarke, who hails from Halifax, Nova Scotia. This is my first Nova Scotia guest. So welcome, Ian, to the Meaning Code.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
I met Ian via Twitter because Ian had posted a little tweet, I think, in reply to somebody else's, talking about an interesting trajectory that he's been on in his life. And I thought it would be great for him to share that with us. And Ian, I'm hoping you can kind of go back and start with your childhood a little bit, give us some background on who you are and how you got to where you are now and what's going on in your life.
Yeah, my childhood, I'm currently residing in Halifax, Nova Scotia, but I was an army brat, so we moved
Me
around
too.
a few times. I was born in Germany of all places, and then Manitoba, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. My family were always decidedly non-believers, non-religious people. My mother would always say that she did believe in God, but in a it never had any sort of importance or meaning. It never made seemingly an impact on our daily lives. And my grandfather from my mother's side, who like the patriarch of our household, he was a firm atheist. And so that kind of set the tone for everything else throughout our family. So we never had any sort of religious upbringing or background. I can remember being at school one day as a kid, and we were celebrating Easter, and the teacher handed out a piece of paper that mentioned Jesus and the crucifixion on it, and I had no idea that Easter was about anything other than a chocolate eggs and bunny rabbits, and I was like, what is this about? I completely All of that stuff was completely outside of my worldview and background. um I remember there was one point when I was a little kid and other kids at school told me that they did Sunday school, and I demanded that my parents take me to Sunday school, and they indulged me for a day or two. I think we went like 2 Sundays, and after the second Sunday, we were driving back home afterwards, and I was like, "Why do we have to go to this thing? It's so boring." And they're like, "We are going because you asked to go." So it's like, so does that mean we don't have to go? It's like, yes, we don't have to go if you don't want to go. So we stopped going. And that was probably the entirety of my church experience growing up,
Well,
was being jealous of
how
other
old were you at
kids.
that time?
That was probably like when I was like 10 years old,
Oh,
maybe 8. Yeah, somewhere in that range,
mhm.
old enough to kind of have ideas about things, but um, I still, all of it was very, very beyond me. But yeah, as we grew up, um, my family definitely fell onto this spectrum of non-belief to outright atheism. And as my teenage years, the kind of the new atheist movement started kicking up, and that just seemed like instinctively the place where I belonged. It suddenly, rather than being a nothing, it was like now I was a something, and I could identify being through a new atheist. And I feel like it probably played out differently if you lived in the States, but here in Canada, it was like religious people never really were a threat. They were always kind of already peripheral. And there's always a sentiment in Canada that you look down south at the crazy Americans and you see them at their worst behavior, and you just kind of so glad we're Canadian and we're not like those crazy Americans. Is this distinctive, like, we build ourselves up by looking down on the worst of American excess. And in that period, when I was like, let's say like 14, 16, 18 years old, there was like, this was like the Iraq War, post 9/11, and there was a lot of that going around, and kind of like new atheism and seeing that, like, how awful the American religious landscape was, really kind of fed together. And a lot of, like, me and all my peers, we could like reassure ourselves on how like great we were by how much we weren't like the worst of America. And, you know, whatever went wrong in my life, it's like watching Gary Springer. It's like it reassures you, well, I'm not that bad because I'm not as bad as those people. And that was like what we did. We just sort of like kept reassuring ourselves, or at least I did, that, you know, whatever is going wrong in my life, at least I'm not some crazy American religious nut job down south. Um, and the new atheist kind of experience really came ready made to reassure you that, yeah, the worst parts about life were religious people, that they were trying to destroy the world, that they, you know, 9/11 was because of religion. And we were good for feeling that like we were smarter than all those religious people who literally believed the things that they believed because of ignorance or stupidity or something like that, brainwashing. And somehow we were enlightened because we thought differently from them. So in retrospect, I can look back on my childhood and I feel like it was really like I didn't have much grounding for most of the things I believed. It was all just like stories I was told. I had almost zero interactions with anyone of faith. All my If someone was religious in my life, they probably kept it to themselves and never really communicated to me. We we had one. I had an aunt and an uncle. I do still have an aunt and uncle. They're not dead, but and they had moved down to the States when I was a baby, and they were Christians and they were religious. And my family always kind of like talked disparagingly about them because of that they were religious. But they never did anything to actually like have a reason to think disparagingly of them. They always were really lovely, loving aunts and uncle. And it's just, you know, I can remember not wanting to talk to them because I was convinced that they would be like bad people. But then when I did talk to them, I was like, oh no, they're really lovely and nice. So yeah, I believed that religious people were like crazy enough to the point that I put walls up with like extended members of my family because I just sort of assumed that they would be terrible, even though they never given me any reason to believe it. And yeah, that was sort of my childhood upbringing up until I basically left home. As I
So I think that the new atheists, they had a ready-made platform for what they were telling people, because even up to that time, at least in the US, all the movies, all the TV shows, everything that you watch, if a character shows up in one of those programs who is in any way religious, you know he's going to be the bad guy.
The bad guy.
Inevitable. Either he's crazy or he's evil. And
yeah,
it's inevitable. And it's been that way for, I would say, at least 30 years in this country. I've been a Christian for 40 years. I became a Christian in 1980 when I was 32. And I had never had any Christian background either, but at least I didn't have to carry around the package of baggage that you had to carry around in your head, from the way that the media always portrayed Christians and movies and all of that. Because in 1980, I don't think they cared much one way or another. They didn't portray religious people as being great, but they also didn't portray them as being world destroyers. But in the intervening 30, 40 years, I would say it's gotten more and more and more that way. So,
I mean, like, I moved to Halifax when I was 12 years old, and like Halifax is probably one of the more secular parts of North America. Like there's some like connection to old like mainline denominations and Catholic Church here, but I don't think they've been a huge part of the landscape for at least since the 1950s. You don't generally, like, this is not a place where you run into religious people. So in those years, and we're always like, we're very like, even since the 90s, we've been a very like pro LGBT kind of community. This is like one of the local focus points for that. And I can just like, even in high school, the atmosphere was one of like, the only portrait of someone who had Christian faith would be like Westboro Baptists holding up signs in protest at soldiers' funerals. Kind of like that was the example. There wasn't really any sort of example present to me. Knew that my aunt and uncle were religious. It wasn't like sort of assumed that they were maybe not as bad as Westboro Baptist, but they were somewhere in that camp. And they had to be handled with like kid gloves so they didn't like go off on us or something. So but
so by this time you're 18 or so?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like I sort of I forget the tweet exactly that we connected on, but it was about this new podcast about new atheism. And what I found really, like, I can remember my early, like 19, 20 years old, being in like following this movement. And, I think I absorbed Richard Dawkins first. And I thought, like, suddenly, like, you read that book and you're like, you kind of always knew you were better than religious people, but he really convinced you were better than religious people. I was like, wow, I must be so smart for like believing these things. I am like the smartest person going. I'm up there with Oxford University professors just because I think the same way as him. And then I started reading and watching Christopher Hitchens, and he's probably in retrospect the worst of the four horsemen and like his actual like arguments, but like he just like so beautifully like spins debates and things, and he just speaks so eloquently, and you're just like, I want to be like that guy. That's like when you're a young adult trying to find your way, and it's like you have this example of someone who's just seems so confident and have such a presence on stage. And it's just like, I want to be like this guy so much. But probably Sam Harris, a third of the big three that I followed, who I got into last. He always had like a little bit of tinge where he was like open to like meditation and some slightly more spiritual not that he would probably use those words, kind of like exploration. He thought there was like good things within Buddhism that could be mined and brought into a secular space and given the atheist treatment. And I came to him last of those three, and even by that point in my like early 20s, I think the looming sense that actually I wasn't a University of Oxford professor and that my life was not that level of comfortable, and like I wasn't that brilliant. I wasn't this, amazing person who the whole world was going to fall over themselves in order to keep praise and award us on. And I kind of like, I discovered adulthood and just sort of like, yeah, things are harder than I sort of always imagined. And into that space, there's no part of me that wanted to give up atheism. I held to it really like firmly. But at the same time, I was like, I feel like I need something else going on here. And like I can so crystal clear, I can just remember like, going to sleep at night and just like this existential dread and fear of death and things just like looming so heavily on me. And it's like you get up in the morning and you like have to put on the happy atheist face, but it's just like feeling like I could never accept the like make your own meaning. I could never accept the like, I'm just going to put family or something at the center of my being and find all the purpose that I need out of it. It always felt hollow, creating my own sense of self-worth. And I just felt empty. And when I was following Sam Harris and his openness to like exploring meditation, I think I took my cue from him, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna explore meditation. And I tried to pursue some Buddhist teachings and things like this. It was always going after Buddhism. I never wanted to renounce atheism though. And the two, as much as like people kept trying to sell me that Buddhism was an atheist religion, it was like, it doesn't actually work together, and the two clash. And I'd have these conversations with people and they would spin jargon at me and they would like talk about things, and we'd have a conversation with someone who I really wanted to like learn from, but then he would tell me that he believed that some goddess descended from the sky and saved sailors on a ship. And I'm like, well, it sounds not atheist to me. And it was always a fight, as much as like I felt like I wanted Buddhism to be the thing that gave me some peace in my life. I wanted Buddhism to be the thing that would like ground me and lead me somewhere. At every point, it just felt like I was in conflict here with something that didn't really have good atheist arguments for the things that it wanted to believe, and always kind of like wanted to slip into this by the side, very God or spiritual kind of framework. And you go for some meditative teaching, and suddenly you're talking about 7 levels of heavens and hells and moving between them, and ghosts and goddesses and things like this. And all of this stuff just seemed to always come packaged together. So, I mean, I kept trying for like 2, 3, 4 years. I was still like following this stuff, trying different denominations of Buddhism, and like it felt like this is my only choice. There's like crazy religious people, and then there's Buddhism light, which represents like religion light, and it's supposed to be atheist. And if I can just find the right group the right teaching, I would be able to make these two things mesh together. But they never really did. Even at, I landed finally on like Soto Zen as the most atheist feeling of all the Buddhist branches, but even there, it's still like it didn't really want to mesh with atheism, and that firm belief that there was no God was something I wasn't willing to let go of. I wanted the goods that religion could give me, but I wanted to actually accept any sort of authority that was like different from my own self, even though I knew even back then that like my putting myself at the center of my universe was an extremely emptying feeling for me. It was always something that gave me nothing but dread. As I said, I would still go to sleep at night, or in moments of panic just feel like I had nothing and I was just floating on air because there was nothing for me to grip onto. It was all of life ended up feeling very like a haze that would just wash over me as I moved from one thing to the other.
Well, so during this time when you were going through all this kind of inner trauma, were you at the same time going to school or working a job, or were you pretty much immobile?
I was going, no, I wasn't immobile. Like, I would wake up, put on the best face I could put on and kind of keep going through life. And, you know, I don't think most people would have like assumed that there was anything going on with me. It's like I was going to school, I was working.
Everybody needs to listen to that, because we think we can tell where people are at by looking at them or by interacting with them. And I've told the story before about my father coming to faith just before he died. And he said, I've wanted this for so many years. But all those years that he says he wanted it, when I looked at him, he was a vociferous atheist. Outside, that's the impression he was giving. But inside, he was hungry, right?
That sounds exactly like me. It's just sort of like you're serving this space where you're mocking religious people. You sound completely confident in your non-belief, and you would like, you know, I would try to make other people not believe. I would assert with authority that like belief in God was foolish. I still had all my, even though I was exploring things, I still had all these talking points, and there was nothing that felt better to me at that point than like finding someone else who didn't believe and just like join together and reminisce on how much it still felt good to say we're better than the religious people. And I don't think I gave generally any impression to other people. It's when I was alone in my apartment, lying on the floor, feeling dead inside, that's where the dread would hit me. It wasn't something that I let other people into. Because as far as I was concerned, the only appropriate conversation you could have about faith or spirituality was with other people, would be to mock the very idea of it itself. I actively cultivated an atmosphere where talking about God was something you couldn't do. You know, in retrospect, I'm like, it's probably the thing I most wanted to do. I can even recall moments where I did, like at a party or something, come across someone, and for some reason, the fact that they were in any way religious or spiritual would come up, and there would be, like, I can recall this feeling of wanting to talk to them, wanting to engage with them and ask them questions, but I couldn't do that because I was the very person saying you can't have these conversations, you can't talk to people about the things they believe in most deeply, because that's how you get ridiculed. That's how I ridicule other people. So it's kind of like I keep telling myself it's not safe to talk about these things until I really believe it's not safe to talk about these things. So like this conversation we're having right here, you talked to me when I was like 25 years old, and would be nothing more off-putting to me than having this conversation. So yeah.
Well, what you just said there was such a great illustration of the verse where Christ says, judge not lest you be judged. Because in the way that we judge others ends up being the same way that we judge ourselves. And it's inevitable, because if we're always looking down our noses at a certain kind of person, and then we realize, wait, that's the best kind of person to be, and I'm not that. Now I'm judged. So, I mean, it really messes us up when we judge other people, because when then we put ourselves under that same judgment. And yeah, it's a very good illustration. Well, so my heart is just bleeding for you right now. When you said you would lay on the floor of your apartment in utter despair, I mean, my heart just breaks over that. How old were you at that time? Like 25?
I mean, this period, I would say like 25 is about the moment I kind of stopped trying with Buddhism. My whole early 20s was kind of like this period where I flirted with it. And there's probably like 2-3 years in there where I was making really firm attempts. I really wanted this to work, but it wasn't working. And then after 25, I kind of, everything in my life just didn't feel like it was working. And I said, I need to change the scenery. So I moved to the UK. And I kind of didn't, it wasn't like something I thought about. I think I just like, once I moved, I stopped trying Buddhism entirely. I just sort of like, that was something I was doing, but it wasn't working. And I don't feel a real need to pick it up again now that I've changed locations and I'm trying to reorientate my life around something else now. And yeah, this period of, I think I moved into a period of like, New Atheism had kind of already started to die by this point. Its internal conflicts had already like ripped itself apart. We were kind of, the world was over that drama. And I just sort of kind of moved into a general sort of none of the above category, where I still wanted something more, but I just kind of didn't think it was going to happen. And I just sort of continued to feel dead inside, even though, and I, yeah, as I said, lying around at night, feeling existential dread, but you have to just kind of keep going through work. At points and pieces, like I would explore something. I remember I decided Quakers were close enough to, you know, a little quasi-atheist community or something. So I went to a Quaker meeting once in hopes that there would be something there. Every once in a while I would see a new Buddhist community or something, and I would try going to one of their meetings, but nothing ever stuck more than like one go. Felt like a non-event. And I would say I largely just sort of, you know, to be brutally honest, like sort of tried to fill the void mostly with more hedonistic pleasure than anything else. I spent probably this period of time just, you're supposed to enjoy life. I moved, I was in a whole new country. And that's sort of what I was going for and what I was doing. But that dread, that like darkness that seemed to always loom over me, like never really left me. It was always there, even if I was having a fairly good period of my life. It was always just like everything is just like not how it's supposed to be. Everything just feels for me. And I think like moving into this stage, like I reconciled with my aunt and uncle, and I never really thought of them as crazies to the same extent anymore. I think I realized that they were actually like, they are good people. So there was that little bit of a break, but I feel like I can remember a period of time where I had like picked up a Bible and I read the Gospel of Matthew. And I immediately, I thought, this is good stuff. I kind of wish this was an atheist religion so I could try it out. Which made no sense, but because I still like, much like Buddhism, like I think that's like when I went and checked out the Quakers, I was like, I want this to be something else. I'm not willing, no matter what happens, to put something other than myself at the center of the universe. And that's just a non-negotiable. So I can remember I read the Gospel of Matthew and I thought, like, this is brilliant stuff, but there's too much God in this for me. I can't make that leap, and I put and I didn't read anymore. I finished the Gospel of Matthew and I had no idea that there was like 3 more Gospels telling the exact same story. I opened Mark and I was like, wait, this is the same story again? What? I can't. Who writes a book with the same story 4 times in a row? Ugh, what a waste. So that also played a part. I started to read Mark and I was like, oh, this sounds too boring. So, but yeah, I just sort of kept through this phase all the way into my 30s, really. Fluctuating one way or another, maybe pursuing a bit of atheism, maybe wanting something else to be real. I think I briefly flirted with Stoicism for a while. I was like, that seems like a thing. But all of them didn't really work. They all just sort of felt like nothing. I think I had a policy that like, life is about suffering. You're just gonna be here, suffer for a while, and at some point I'm gonna die. And that's what life is. There's not really, you shouldn't expect more than that. If you get a brief bubble of joy for some reason, savor it, because those bubbles don't last. And the despair and chaos of the world will eventually consume it. So, and that was my philosophy in life. There is no meaning, there is no purpose. There's just the decay of the universe. So, I was a happy person.
Well, I mean, you obviously are not alone. There are so many people that are at that same place. And,
Yeah.
and I mean, the idea of, and it goes back I mean, I think it was Democritus who said there is nothing but atoms and the void. That's a happy thought. So the no meaning, no purpose thing, there are so many people that believe that. And I've heard more than once this idea that the earth is just a meaningless rock hurtling through space, going around another meaningless burning rock, and and the whole thing is pointless, and life is hard, and it sucks, and we suffer, and then we die. I mean, I hear that all the time. So you were not alone, but you probably felt alone because you weren't willing to talk about this with other people. You didn't know that other people were feeling the same way.
Yeah. No, that you're nailing it. You're hitting the nail there. I don't think I was that alone in a lot of the things I was feeling. I don't think that I was that of an exception. It felt like no one was allowed to be honest about what they were feeling. And like, it may be kind of bitter against a lot of things. Thing that people hold to and they cling to and they like put forward is like, this is some sort of like good thing that can drive my life. And it just felt like, it just feels like a lie to me. And I just feel like you're not being honest in holding to it. I think his name's like Pete Townsend. He was like a philosopher from like Australia or something. And I ended up like appreciating his work because I was like, you feel at least honest to me on the things that you say and believe, even if it takes you to some weird spots. But yeah, I think you're definitely right. It's just sort of, you feel very alone, even though there's probably a lot of people around you who feel the same way, because everyone's putting on the face of being happy and together. And it feels like other people are okay and they're enjoying life and they're seemingly happy, well-adjusted individuals who are okay with meaninglessness of the universe. And I'm going to base on as much as possible, but on the inside, I'm screaming like, how can you deal with this? How can you stare into the void and
Okay, I'm starting to lose your audio. Maybe your headphones need to be adjusted a little bit. There we go. Okay. So at this point, you're still in the UK? And you're
yes.
And what were you, if I can ask, what were you doing there?
Just working through this whole period. I mostly was working in hospitality, stuff like this.
And what year was it?
I was in the UK for like 5 years. I think so, from like 31 in my age. I'm 37 now. I'd have to do the math as to what years those were.
Oh, so you weren't there during COVID?
No, I moved back before that.
You've been back before COVID. Okay, that was my I wondered about that because I knew that the two countries had different sets of restrictions and wondered how all that played into things. But
yeah, no, I knew I still had a fair number of like contacts and friends during COVID period. So I can remember during the hard lockdowns, I would be like doing my Zoom calls with people back in the UK and Scotland, and being like, how's your lockdown going? And finding the odd of their stories where they all stand outside and clap for the NHS every single day has been like, yeah, we don't do that in Canada, that's for sure. But at this point, I decided I had been in a long-term relationship in Scotland. We moved there, and then very unexpectedly, my partner just died one night.
Oh,
It wasn't like anything planned. Um, like apparently some genetic defect in their heart, and no one knew about it. So we just went to bed one night, and in the morning, they were dead. And we kind of, I never had anyone close to me die up till that point. Yeah, it was most surreal experience of my life up to that point. And afterwards, I got to a point of feeling okay, but I was just like, I don't think I can stay here anymore. I think I have to go back to Canada. I need to be near family. And it just felt difficult to stay there. So because previous to that, I think my plans, if you had asked me, this was it. I was staying in Scotland. I still love Scotland. I think it's an amazing place. But I moved back, and then so yeah, I started living in Halifax again. At some point, I started a new relationship. And that went, but he was American and I was not. And COVID hit, and he became trapped in America, and I became trapped in Canada. And so he was in Seattle at the time. And at some point, America never cared during COVID times about other people coming into the country. So, but Canada wouldn't let him come into Canada. So we decided that I would go to America, we would get married, and then he could come back to Canada with me. So I flew to Seattle and we got married. And very strangely, like this is the night after we've been to City Hall and we signed the papers and we got married. And we were just kind of like walking around outside in this weird landscape of this city that neither one of us lived in. And during COVID times, and just sort of walking around, and he had this weird moment, and he was suddenly like racked with guilt about things and was becoming very emotional. And we were alone in a park, and I don't really know why or how, but like he just had so much guilt, and I didn't know what to really say to him, but I found myself suddenly, like, I don't know if I had just like retained from all those years ago reading the Gospel of Matthew or whatever, but I found myself suddenly telling him about the grace that Jesus offered. And I explained to him, even though I was definitely not a Christian, but for some reason I explained to him the gospel in that moment. And that seemed to like stir something in him. And that was kind of the end of it at that moment. But then we did get back to Canada, and maybe a month later, been acting really, really weirdly and kind of and emotional. And then finally he me and we kind of confronted each other about this. And like, I think I have to tell you something. I was like, what is it? And I expected like something really horrific was going on, but it was just this like, I think I've become a Christian. And at that moment, I was mostly just like relieved. It's like, okay, I thought this was something really, really out there and awful, but okay, you're having some weird religious thing. That's fine. We can move on. But he got in contact with some people, and because he was looking for a church to go to, and they finally recommended a church to him. But he didn't drive. I did all the driving. And it was on the other side of town. And he's like, can you drive me to this church? And I said, sure, I'll drive you to this church. But of course, I was like, I'm not going to sit in the car the whole time. So I'll come in with you. So I went into this church, and it was almost immediately like it was the first time in my life I ever interacted with people of Christian faith who were letting their faith hang out. They were like, there was no hiding what people were doing there, who they were. It's like we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about the gospel, we're talking about salvation, about the plan of new creation, and everyone was just very honest about it. But they were also wonderful people. Everything from my childhood, from my young adult life, told me that these are like going to be the worst people possible. Completely upended. And that part of me that had always been like treating religious people like you watch Jerry Springer, and it's like, I'm not them, so at least I'm okay, was suddenly like, no, I'm not okay, but they have something that is okay. And I spent a year going to church every single Sunday, but not believing any of it, but just still kind of like floored by who these people were and how they treated me and how they the world and who they were. And it just sort of, yeah, it left me pressure of anything. Um, so I kind of spent like a year going to church, not believing it. And at some point, I think I made the change where I said, even though I don't believe this is true, I want this to be true, because what this is more beautiful than anything else I know. And that, for me, was a position I found myself taking, that what I had known up to that point just seemed so ugly in comparison to what I was seeing now. And at this point where I had this head knowledge, and I had heard enough and seen enough that I understood what the gospel message was, and I understood what I needed to do. I couldn't let go of everything I had been clinging on to. That I had this person that was me, and if I let go, that person wouldn't exist anymore. I wasn't staring into a void anymore. I was staring into this endless sea of love, but I couldn't let go because I would just be lost in it. And I fought that for a long time, just sort of wanting to believe, but not willing. And I just wouldn't make a turn to believe. And then very unexpectedly, I just sort of finally found myself, and I was all alone, and I just sort of sat down, and I did finally pray, and I just asked Jesus if he was there and if he would help me. And it was like suddenly being there with someone who had been patiently waiting for me my whole life. And really looked back since then. That was about 2 years ago at this point. And yeah, I've been on this journey ever since. And as much as like I still have ups and downs in like my mental health, it's I don't ever have that feeling of lying on my apartment floor, feeling dead inside in a way that I used to feel. This thing that I thought was just like pervasive to being alive in existence has disappeared to me. Things are difficult sometimes, but they're not, it doesn't feel like the universe is without purpose or meaning. And I'm not left staring all alone with myself at the center of the entire cosmos and everything else just being a void. Yeah.
That's amazing. So what kind of a church did you find there? You said there aren't very many churches in Halifax, or
I mean, there is a good scattering, as I said, like mainline and Catholic churches scattered
Mhm.
about. We have our Halifax has kind of got an old Victorian feel in the downtown,
Mhm.
so you can see big churches that look fancy. But church I ended up going to was they're now non-denominational. They used to be open brethren, but they sort of made that switch from open brethren to non-denominational before we got there. And, you know, vaguely, most people's, like my mother asked me, what kind of church are you going to? And I said, non-denominational. And she's like, oh, so Baptist. I'm like, we're not Baptist, but yes, there's some similarities.
Well, so what does your
So,
family think about all this? I mean, have you talked with your family at all, or have they noticed anything, or
like, as I said, my mother remained always kind of like mildly the most spiritual of all of them. She doesn't really believe, and she's attended some services with me, and we had a discussion. She told me she finds the concept of grace kind of offensive.
Mm.
She's like, I don't think that people who do bad things should be forgiven. Um, which, yes, grace can be very offensive to people, but um, really, I don't know why you think you're so wonderful yourself. I mean, that's probably my position previously. So, my grandfather, the patriarchal atheist of the family, remains steadfast, and he throws like condescending and mocking jibes. Um, but he's in his 90s now and kind of moving into a phase of life where he seemingly doesn't even um, I know he's more knowledgeable than he is at this point. Some of the dialogues, like he doesn't understand some things, and like I know that at one point you were smarter than this on these subjects.
Mhm.
So um, it feels somewhat, his jibes don't hurt. I'll say that his jibes, um, they just feel sad generally. And his son, who is the um, uncle who was a Christian even when I was growing up, you know, him and his wife have had a lifetime of witnessing and preaching to him and trying to reach him. I know that there's nothing that they would love more than to see him um, make a confession, but especially as he's in his 90s, because you know he's still really a wonderful person, and you know I admired him very, very greatly. I still admire him in many ways, especially when I was a little kid. Um, there's probably no one when I was a little kid who I wanted more to be like than to be like him. So it's a point of prayer for those in us in my family who pray. But um,
Well, I think there's always
yeah,
hope. Like I
uh,
said, my father became a believer maybe 5 months before he died, and he'd lived his whole life angry, and he was angry because he had had a grandmother who was like super fundamentalist religious, Was she Seventh-day Adventist or something? It isn't the denomination that makes a difference, really. It was her own approach. She had this idea that everybody had to do things a certain way. And if you didn't do things a
Mhm.
certain way, you were going to go to hell. And she would line all the little kids up in a row and she would tell them, now you have to do this and this and this and this, or you're going to go to hell. And when my dad was a little kid, that just frightened him and turned him away. And then he never wanted anything to do with any religion after that. And
Mhm.
so he was angry his whole life about a lot of things. And then after he turned to faith, he wanted to talk to my pastor. And my pastor said after that talk with him, he said, I am totally convinced that your father has turned to faith. He says, I've never heard anybody use the name of Jesus more tenderly than your father. And that it was something that just happened, like literally overnight. He was in a hospital and I had to pray for him because in this hospital, they would tie him into the bed at night because he had a tendency to get up during the night and start walking around and carrying the oxygen cart with him and all that kind of stuff. And they were
Mhm.
afraid he was going to fall and hurt himself. So they would tie him into the bed. And he was experiencing something like, they called it Alzheimer's, but I knew at the time it wasn't Alzheimer's because he went into the hospital perfectly fine. And then 2 weeks later, he's like in the head, kind of crazy. So I knew it wasn't that. I knew it was something else. I finally did some research and discovered that his electrolytes had gotten out of balance. And so he had a sort of dementia that came from that.
Mhm.
But anyway, he's in the midst of this dementia and terrified because they're going to tie him into this bed. And he was a big, strong master sergeant guy. You know, I told you I grew up as an army brat. And so I prayed for him. I just put my arms around him and I said, Daddy, I just want you to know you're not alone. God is with you. And I have to go now and take Mom to the motel and we'll come back tomorrow morning. And when I came back the next morning, he was wreathed in smiles and he still couldn't talk, but he's pointing at the ceiling and smiling. And he couldn't tell me what it was he was experiencing because he couldn't talk at that point. But the chaplain came into the hospital room, inviting everybody to come to the Sunday service. And my dad's like, yeah, let's go, let's go. He's like motioning. He wanted to go. And I was very surprised because the chaplain was Black and my father was very racist towards Blacks. But we went down to the chapel. The pastor, they sang a few hymns, and all during the hymns, my dad is just sobbing. Then the pastor starts preaching, and my father's listening so avidly. And after the message, the pastor said, okay, now we're going to have communion. And for those of you that are hooked up to oxygen and everything, you can stay in the pews and everybody else can come down to the communion railing. My dad's tugging at me. No, I want to go down there. So I get all his gear. We go down to the communion railing. We kneel down at the communion railing. And the pastor comes around with the cup and the bread, and my father reaches out for it and he turns to me and he says, you don't know how many years I've been waiting for this. His mind and his voice were clear as a bell at that point. It's just like, wow. You know, after all these years of trying to share with him, being rebuffed, being called every name in the book, and all of that, God did the work on his own. He didn't need me.
That is amazing. So,
And then
absolutely.
afterwards, he said what had happened was in the middle of the night, he had had this dream or vision or something where he saw the entirety of the creation of the universe and the development of mankind. He saw the whole thing in this dream or this vision or something. And he knew without question that Jesus Christ was God and master of the universe. And it just like came to him in that moment. So God can do it. He can do it any way he wants.
I mean, I completely, I'm not like, it feels with members of my family, like sometimes it becomes a lot. Um, there are moments where it really breaks me down. But I hold to that God can do anything, that that no one is beyond God's saving power. And I I like to think that, as his jibes have become more harmless as the years go on, that a miracle will happen and that he will come to believe. Because I have to say, there's, of all the people I've known in my life, there is no one I would probably be more overcome with joy to see him at the end of everything, standing there with me, of everyone else who had believed, ready to meet Jesus. I feel like I just don't want to go on without him, I guess, is the thing. So I really do
Have
hope.
you ever told him how much you admire him?
Yes, I have. Um, we've had moments where I kind of express this level of like how much I admire him. He starts crying, and I cry, and everyone cries. And it's a great moment. But I think it's it it feels like an exercise in patience, I guess, when you're dealing with someone who, and there's multiple people like this in my life at this point, who, like, God is stirring somewhere in their lives, something's going on that your love, God's love, this isn't returning void, and yet they don't believe. And not everything happens instantaneously. So,
Well, I mean, you can see in your own life that I'm sure that if you look back now, you can see in your own life that all those years that you didn't believe and that you resisted, that God is actually finding a way to use those years in your life and in the lives.
yeah,
right?
Yeah. Like when I finally did repent and turn to Jesus and ask him into my life, it was so over that moment, this sense of there, and had always been waiting and had always been present and participating. And, I look back, like when I read the Gospel of Matthew and it blew me away that I wouldn't believe, or when my aunt and uncle had witnessed to me as a child, but I stayed steadfast in thinking that they were terrible people for this. And there was other moments in my life where I just I had felt God's love on me, but I kept running away from it and avoiding it and keeping it cut off. And all those moments, when it came to that moment, I could see all of those steps leading up to where I was then, and that they had made that change and they had been a part of this journey. I feel it's hard to explain all of it. Like there's some point I wish, like, even as much as I gave you a fairly long conversation about, where my journey had gone, there's just so many like little tidbits that I think back on, of like here when I was standing on this beach and I I just felt such a complete like love, and I didn't know where it was coming from, but I wanted there to be somebody who loved me like that. Like these little moments all throughout that at the moment of turning to Jesus were crystal clear in that path and seeing what God had done, but still felt at the time when they were happening like these are isolated incidents. So yeah, I agree with you. I think you don't know. It's hard for us to see the wonderful like tapestry that God is weaving in people's lives. He's the only one who has the bird's eye view to see the whole thing as it's unfolding. So, yeah.
I heard an interesting analogy today. I was listening to a video of Bernardo Kastrup talking. Do you know who he is?
No, maybe I would recognize his work, but I'm terrible with names.
He's some kind of I think he calls himself an analytical idealist, something like that. He's a philosopher. He's got a very interesting mind. You wouldn't call him a traditional Christian or anything like that, but he does look at the world through a lens that includes the possibility of something outside of ourselves. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But he was saying it for any of us to think, he says the greatest slavery is to believe that we're responsible for the whole world. When you put yourself at the center, then you're kind of making yourself responsible for the universe. And he said that's really the greatest slavery there can be. And he said it's a little bit like being a blossom on an apple tree and thinking that you're responsible to tell the apple tree how many apples it's supposed to make every year and how many seeds, and and the little blossom is like unwilling to let itself wither and die because it thinks that it's the most important thing. So then it never becomes an apple. It never bears fruit, never makes the seed it's supposed to make to carry itself on in the future, because it's so determined that it's going to be in control of everything. And I thought that was a pretty interesting analogy to think of the way we can get when we make ourselves the center of our world.
Yeah, and that sounds exactly like where I had been at. And you've expressed it. He expressed it very eloquently there. It's like this staring into the void that I always did growing up, and then through most of my life, it's like the only thing I have was myself. I'm the center of all of this. And if good things are going to happen, it has to be because of me. It has to be because of the things that I've done. I have to create this world of good for myself, or there's no hope. There's no one else here I can rely on. There's nothing else that's going to save me here. Everything has to be me. And I think even in the early days, as soon as I came out of New Atheism, as soon as I started like exploring religious ideas, it was because I had come to the conclusion that there may be nothing, but I'm not going to save myself. It's beyond me to tell the apple tree how many apples to produce. I can't do that. And that's why I wanted something else, because it just felt distinctly like I can't be the author of my own salvation here. So something else has to do it. And in those moments, I think that's what I found so compelling about when I read the Gospel of Matthew, even though I rejected it. It's just kind of like, for the first time, there was this sense that something else might actually offer me a path forward, that there would be something else that could save me, but I wanted to renounce myself as the center. So, and in Buddhism, it just felt like, great, I can just stop caring about being saved, and then that solves the problem. As long as you don't care, then it's fine. Which, you know, standing on the other side of it feels like, well, that was a terrible idea. You shouldn't just like renounce caring about all of this. But at the time, that felt like this is the best solution. It's just like drive yourself cold to all feelings of wanting things to work out. So, but
So you're working in Halifax now. Are you still in the hospitality area, or are you doing something else?
yeah, I'm still in hospitality, though now I've moved to owning rather than working exclusively. So, I opened a restaurant like a year ago, exactly, which was like little story, because I came to believe in, at some point, I sort of just had this like, okay, believe in you, Jesus. I believe you are King of the universe. What do I do now? Like, what's the next step? And I prayed this, and I always like wanted to open a restaurant, and it just felt distinctly like, but it wasn't like, it was something I always wanted to do, but I had like a number of things in mind of like, where am I supposed to go? But I prayed very intently one night that I wanted some clarification on what to do next. And the very next day, I went into work, and this opportunity to open a restaurant opened up. So I said, all right, I feel like you're going to deliver an answer. I'm going to go for it. So we're doing this journey right now of being an entrepreneur and owning a business, and seeing how that goes, which has been all sorts of like its own learning experiences and an intense degree of learning to trust in God's provision, no matter how, like, this is something I could definitely never ever done before. I think if I had to rely on my own feelings of adequacy in order to accomplish things, like, I could never have taken on a project this big, because it just would have been beyond me. I would have only seen my limitations here. And I still intensely see my limitations in all of this. But despite that, I can trust in somebody else. I can trust that there is a God who has my back. And even if this business fails spectacularly, a slight in any way on who I am in God's eyes. And I can rest in who he sees I am. So it gives me the freedom to actually do these things, and the joy to enjoy this journey as I'm on it, regardless of where things go forward from here. So
that's so well said. So, are you the cook?
I am the cook and business operator. So yeah.
And what kind of a restaurant is it?
We are a German restaurant. We do classic schnitzels and pretzels and things like this. So in the heart of downtown Halifax, it's called PMQ Restaurant, which is named after the Canadian military housing they would build for families.
It's called what?
PMQ.
PMQ.
So it's when back in the beginning of the story, when I lived in Germany as an army brat, we lived in PMQ housing, so builds this style of housing for its soldiers and their families. And I liked it because it was my connection to Germany, living in these housings, but also it was, it felt like it was an exercise in intentional community building. It was building homes and communities for its people. And I felt like that's what I wanted this restaurant to be, was an exercise in intentional community building. So in which, by those metrics, it's been a round wonderful success. I feel like lots of people have been able to engage, and it's been very rewarding in ways that everyone can come together and we can share. But yeah, PMQ is the name of the restaurant. So
Wow, I never ever would have guessed that you would open a German restaurant, but that's like
I never guessed that either. So
well, that's one of the great things I think about following Christ, is it's a never-ending adventure. If when you're really leaning in and trusting, it becomes a never-ending adventure. I mean, you're very young in the faith yet. I've been a Christian for 40 years, and there are times when I really lean in and trust, and there are other times when I kind of pull back and start trying to do life on my own, and things don't work out so well. But
yeah,
when I'm really leaning in and trusting, it's a never-ending adventure. And as a result, I've just done so many things in my life that I never ever dreamed I would have been involved in. And
100%.
yeah. So I'm very excited about your future. We've been talking for about an hour and a half now, so I think we better wind it up. But anytime you want to talk in the future, if you have something new that you've been thinking about, I would love to talk to you. The way you express yourself with such depth and clarity, it almost makes me think that you should be a writer. But right now you're busy getting your business off the ground, so I won't hassle you for a while.
my old pastor said, I was doing lunch with them, and he said to me, he was like, you should like consider taking seminary courses or something. And I was like, do you have any idea how little time I have? I'm not going to. We can talk about things in a few years' time when I have some space to myself. But yeah, I just wanted to like your comment about, once you start following Christ, this like amazing journey that you go on. It's 100%. So many ways that my life felt so drastically one way, and now has gone in a completely different direction. I was having this conversation with a friend of mine earlier about it. She asked me, are you an introvert or an extrovert? And I was like, I don't think I like that question, because I don't think I believe in that anymore. I think my whole life I would have told you I was an introvert, that I get my rest by being alone and by having no one involved in my life. And that was where I was most comfortable. And suddenly finding myself surrounded by community and people. And there's nothing I want more than to be intensely engaged with folks. And I can't, like, it feels suffocating now to be on my own. And I would 100% say I'm probably an extrovert now. But the whole question suddenly feels very like, no, I don't think I agree with that anymore. I think this is whatever it is, I don't think anyone's meant to be alone. I don't think anyone's meant to be cut off, even though many people feel that way. So my life is just seemingly, I never know what's going to happen next, and it can be exhausting, but it's never been more rewarding or fulfilling than it has been now. So I'm just excited to keep going and see where things go next. So
Well, I'm so happy that you took the time to make that little comment on Twitter, because it opened up this whole world to me. And I think it will open up a whole world to a lot of other people who listen. So I really appreciate you spending the time with me, Ian, and wish
Well,
you
this was,
the best.
don't usually get to spend this much time talking about my testimony and journey thus far. So I really appreciate it. This has been lovely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you have a great week.
You too. Have yourself a lovely, I guess, midday there where you are. So,
Yes. Good evening
all
to
right.
you in Halifax, Nova
Good evening.
Scotia. Yeah, bye-bye.